A 9-year-old boy drags his unconscious injured sister into the police station and collapses from exhaustion. When officers discover the reason behind their condition, an emergency operation is launched immediately. The late September air carried the first whisper of autumn through the open windows of the Walsh family's modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street in Millbrook, Vermont. 9-year-old Timothy Walsh sat cross-legged on the worn hardwood floor of the living room, watching his father Robert stuff sleeping bags into an oversized duffel bag with an enthusiasm that seemed almost foreign to the man who had spent most recent evenings slumped in his recliner, nursing cheap beer and staring at whatever flickered across their second-hand television screen. "Timmy, can you grab the lantern from the garage?" Robert called out, his voice carrying a lightness that the boy had not heard in months. "The big Coleman one, not the little flashlight." Timothy scrambled to his feet, his small frame moving with the eager energy that only children possess when sensing that something special might actually happen. As he passed through the narrow hallway that connected their living room to the kitchen, he caught a glimpse of his 12-year-old sister Emma helping their mother Diana pack sandwiches into a red cooler that had seen better days. Emma's light brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore the faded blue sweatshirt that had become her uniform since school started 3 weeks ago. "Make sure you pack extra peanut butter sandwiches," Emma was saying to their mother, her voice carrying that matter-of-fact tone she had developed over the past year. "You know how Timmy gets when he is hungry on long car rides." Diana Walsh paused in her sandwich making, her tired green eyes meeting her daughter's gaze. At 34, Diana looked older than her years, with premature lines around her eyes and a weariness that seemed to have settled into her bones like winter cold. Her auburn hair, once vibrant and full, now hung limp around her shoulders, pulled back in a practical ponytail that spoke more of efficiency than style. "I am packing plenty of food, sweetheart," Diana replied, though Timothy could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "This trip is going to be good for all of us. We need this time together as a family." The word family hung in the air with a weight that seemed almost visible. Timothy had learned to read the spaces between his parents' words, the careful way his mother spoke when she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. He had also learned to recognize the particular type of hope that lived in his mother's voice when she talked about his father's promises, a hope that had been disappointed so many times it had become fragile as spun glass. Timothy found the Coleman lantern on a dusty shelf in the garage, nestled between paint cans and tools that his father used for the construction jobs that came and went with increasing irregularity. The garage smelled of motor oil and sawdust, with an underlying odor of beer that seemed to permeate everything Robert touched these days. As Timothy lifted the lantern, he noticed 3 empty beer bottles tucked behind a toolbox, their labels peeled away by nervous fingers. When he returned to the living room, Robert was holding up a small camp stove with the pride of a man displaying a trophy. "This little beauty is going to make the best camp coffee you have ever tasted," he announced to the room, though Timothy noticed his father's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Nothing beats coffee made over an open flame while listening to the sounds of nature. Emma appeared in the doorway, carrying the packed cooler with both hands. Despite being only 12, she had inherited their mother's practical nature and their father's stubborn determination, a combination that often made her seem older than her years. "Dad, you promised Mom you would not drink this weekend," she said with the directness that often surprised adults who were not prepared for such honesty from a child. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the sound of Mrs. Henderson's television through the thin walls of their duplex. Robert's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, embarrassment, and finally a forced smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Of course, Princess," Robert said, using the nickname he had called Emma since she was small. "This weekend is about family time, just the 4 of us and the beautiful Vermont mountains." He reached over and ruffled Emma's hair with a gentleness that reminded Timothy of the father he used to know, the one who had taught him to ride a bicycle and had once built Emma an elaborate dollhouse from scrap lumber. Diana appeared in the doorway behind Emma, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She wore jeans that had seen too many washings and a flannel shirt that had once belonged to Robert. Timothy could see the skepticism in his mother's eyes, the way she watched her husband as if he were a stranger who might disappear at any moment. "Robert, you packed everything we discussed?" Diana asked, her tone carefully neutral. "The first aid kit, the extra water, the emergency flares? Everything is ready," Robert replied, hefting the duffel bag to demonstrate its weight. "Plus, I talked to Bill Henderson next door, and he said the weather forecast is perfect for the next 3 days. Clear skies, mild temperatures. It is going to be like something out of a postcard." Timothy found himself caught between his parents' careful dance of hope and doubt, watching as his mother tried to believe and his father tried to be believable. He had overheard enough late-night arguments through the thin bedroom walls to understand that this camping trip represented more than just a weekend getaway. It was his father's attempt at redemption, his mother's gamble on the man she had married 15 years ago, and perhaps their family's last chance to find their way back to each other. "Can we stop at Morrison's General Store on the way?" Emma asked, settling onto the couch with the unconscious grace of a child who had learned to make herself comfortable wherever she happened to be. "They have those trail mix bars that do not make my asthma act up." Emma's asthma had developed 2 years earlier, around the same time their father's drinking had gotten worse, though Timothy was not sure if there was a connection or if life had simply decided to make everything more complicated at once. The inhaler she carried everywhere had become as much a part of her as her stubborn streak and her habit of collecting interesting rocks. "Of course we can stop," Robert said, and Timothy heard genuine warmth in his father's voice. "In fact, I was thinking we could let you two pick out some candy for the trip. Maybe some of those gummy bears you like, Timmy." The offer of candy felt like such a normal, fatherly gesture that Timothy felt a flutter of hope in his chest. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe the man packing camping gear with such enthusiasm was the real Robert Walsh, and the one who had been living in their house for the past year was the imposter. "When do we leave?" Timothy asked, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. "First thing in the morning," Robert replied. "I want to get to Pine Ridge Campground early enough to set up our tents and maybe do some exploring before it gets dark." He paused, looking around at his family with an expression Timothy could not quite read. "This is going to be the best weekend we have had in a long time. I promise." There was that word again, promise. Timothy had learned that promises in the Walsh household were fragile things, easily broken by circumstances beyond anyone's control. But as he looked at his father's face, seeing something there that reminded him of birthday mornings and Christmas excitement, he allowed himself to believe that maybe this promise would be different. Diana moved to the window and pulled back the faded curtain to look out at the street. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their small front yard, where the grass had grown too long and the flower boxes his mother had planted in spring now held only the brown remnants of forgotten hopes. "Pine Ridge is pretty remote," Diana said, still looking out the window. "No cell phone coverage, no nearby neighbors. Are you sure that is the best choice for our first camping trip in 3 years?" "That is exactly why it is perfect," Robert replied, moving to stand behind his wife. For a moment, Timothy saw his father place a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder, and she did not pull away. No distractions, no interruptions. Just us and nature. Timothy watched this moment between his parents, recognizing it as one of those fragile instances when the people they used to be seemed to flicker back to life. His mother leaned back slightly against his father's chest, and for a heartbeat, they looked like the couple in the wedding photo that still sat on the mantel, dusty but not yet discarded. "The forecast really does look perfect," Diana said softly. "And the children need this. We all need this." Emma looked up from the magazine she had been flipping through. "Can we make s'mores? Real ones, with the marshmallows that get all gooey and burnt." "S'mores are mandatory on camping trips," Robert declared with mock seriousness. "In fact, I am pretty sure it is against Vermont state law to go camping without making s'mores at least once." Emma giggled, and the sound filled the room like music. Timothy could not remember the last time he had heard his sister laugh with such pure delight. The sound seemed to transform the cramped living room, making the faded furniture and peeling wallpaper fade into insignificance. As evening settled over Millbrook, the Walsh family continued their preparations with an energy that felt almost desperate in its intensity. Robert checked and rechecked their camping supplies while Diana packed enough food for a week-long expedition. Timothy helped Emma organize their clothes, and they whispered excitedly about the adventures that awaited them in the mountains. But as Timothy lay in the narrow bed he shared with Emma that night, listening to his parents' muffled voices through the thin walls, he could not shake the feeling that something important was about to change. His parents were speaking too quietly for him to make out words, but he could hear the tension in their tones, the careful way they were negotiating the terms of hope. Tomorrow would bring the mountains, the promise of Esmores and adventure, and perhaps the miracle his family desperately needed. Or it would bring another disappointment to add to the growing collection that seemed to follow them like shadows. As sleep finally claimed him, Timothy's last conscious thought was a prayer to whatever force governed the universe of 9-year-old boys and broken families. Please let this time be different. Please let his father keep this promise. Please let them find in those distant mountains the family they used to be. Outside, the Vermont night settled over Millbrook with the quiet dignity of autumn approaching, unaware that morning would set in motion a chain of events that would test the bonds of love in ways that none of them could possibly imagine. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes Vermont autumns legendary. The drive to Pine Ridge Campground wound through hills painted in brilliant reds and golds, with the Green Mountains rising like ancient guardians against a sky so blue it seemed almost artificial. Timothy pressed his face to the passenger window of their aging Honda Civic, watching the landscape transform from suburban neighborhoods to rural farmland to dense forest. "Look at those colors," Diana breathed from the front seat, her voice carrying a wonder that Timothy had not heard in months. "I had forgotten how beautiful it gets up here." Robert navigated the increasingly narrow roads with careful attention, his hands steady on the steering wheel. He had been unusually quiet during the early morning preparations, moving through their departure routine with the focused intensity of a man trying very hard to do everything right. Timothy noticed that his father had shaved carefully and combed his hair, even putting on the flannel shirt that Diana had given him for his birthday 2 years ago. "Are we almost there?" Emma asked from the back seat, where she sat surrounded by pillows and blankets like a princess in a fabric fortress. Her inhaler rested on the seat beside her, a constant reminder of the caution that shadowed her adventures. "According to the map, we should see the campground entrance in about 10 minutes, Robert replied, glancing at his daughter in the rearview mirror. "And Emma, wait until you see this place. The brochure says there are hiking trails that lead to waterfalls and rock formations that are thousands of years old." The enthusiasm in his father's voice made Timothy feel that familiar flutter of hope. Maybe this really would be different. Maybe the mountains held some kind of magic that could transform his father back into the man who used to tell bedtime stories and build snow forts that were architectural marvels of childhood engineering. Pine Ridge Campground appeared around a bend in the road like something from a postcard, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering evergreens and deciduous trees in full autumn glory. The registration office was a log cabin that looked like it had been there since Vermont was first settled, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and flower boxes still bright with late-season mums. "This is perfect," Diana said, and Timothy could hear tears threatening in her voice. "Robert, this is absolutely perfect." They registered with an elderly man named Frank who seemed to have stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting, complete with suspenders and a pipe that filled the office with the sweet smell of cherry tobacco. Frank explained that their campsite was about half a mile down a gravel road, tucked into a grove of pine trees with access to a stream and hiking trails. "You folks picked a good weekend," Frank told them as he handed Robert a hand-drawn map of the campground. "Weather is going to be beautiful, and the foliage is at its peak. Just remember that cell phone coverage is pretty much non-existent once you get more than a mile from the main road. This is one of the last truly disconnected places in Vermont." The isolation that had worried Diana the night before now seemed like a blessing. As they drove the narrow gravel road to their campsite, Timothy felt as if they were leaving behind not just the modern world but all the problems that had been suffocating their family like smoke from a fire that would not die. Their campsite exceeded even Robert's optimistic descriptions. Nestled in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines, it featured a stone fire ring, a picnic table weathered to silver gray, and access to a stream that bubbled and laughed as it wound its way through the forest. The sound of running water mixed with birdsong and the whisper of wind through pine needles created a symphony that seemed to wash away the urban stress that had clung to them like dust. Setting up camp became a family project in the truest sense. Robert showed Timothy how to identify the best spot for their tent, explaining the importance of level ground and natural windbreaks. Emma and Diana worked together to organize their food supplies and set up the camp kitchen, with Emma taking charge of arranging their eating utensils with the precision of a military quartermaster. "Dad, can you teach me how to tie those special knots?" Timothy asked as Robert secured their tent skylines. "These are called bowline knots," Robert explained, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Every man should know how to tie a proper bowline. My father taught me when I was about your age, and his father taught him. It is one of those things that gets passed down." As Robert's hands guided Timothy's smaller fingers through the motions of the knot, Timothy felt connected not just to his father but to a lineage of men who had known practical things, useful things. For a moment, the weight of family tradition felt comforting rather than burdensome. The morning dissolved into afternoon with the fluid ease of time, moving at nature's pace rather than civilization's frantic rhythm. They hiked a trail that wound along the stream, with Emma collecting interesting rocks and Timothy learning to identify different types of trees. Diana walked hand in hand with Robert, and occasionally Timothy caught glimpses of his parents whispering to each other with the intimacy of lovers rather than the careful politeness of strangers sharing a house. "Look at this one," Emma called out, holding up a piece of quartz that caught the filtered sunlight like captured fire. "It is almost perfectly clear. I bet it is 1,000 years old." "Could be even older," Robert said, accepting the rock from his daughter with the reverence due to a precious artifact. "The geological formations up here date back millions of years. You are holding a piece of history, princess." Emma beamed at the validation, and Timothy saw his sister as she truly was not just the responsible 12-year-old who helped manage their household chaos, but a child discovering the wonders of the world with fresh eyes and an open heart. They returned to camp in the late afternoon with appetites sharpened by mountain air and physical activity. Robert started a fire with an expertise that reminded Timothy that his father possessed skills beyond the defeated resignation that had characterized him for so long. As flames danced in the stone ring, casting shifting shadows on the pine trees around them, the Walsh family seemed to remember what they could be when the world was not pressing down upon them. "This reminds me of when I was a kid," Diana said, settling onto a log beside the fire. "My family used to camp at Lake Champlain every summer. My brother and I would spend hours skipping stones and catching fireflies." "Tell us about when you were little, Mom," Emma requested, snuggling close to her mother as the evening air began to carry autumn's chill. For the next hour, Diana shared stories of her childhood that Timothy had never heard, tales of summer adventures and winter sledding, of a family that had been happy and whole. As she spoke, Timothy saw his mother as she must have been before life had taught her to be cautious, before hope had become a luxury she could not afford. Robert contributed his own stories of growing up in rural New Hampshire, of helping his father with construction projects and learning to fish in mountain streams not unlike the one that ran beside their campsite. Timothy marveled at these glimpses of his father as a boy, trying to imagine the man who now struggled with demons that seemed to have no names or faces. As darkness settled over the mountains with the dramatic finality of a theater curtain, they prepared dinner over the camp stove and open fire. Hot dogs roasted on improvised spits tasted better than any restaurant meal, and even the canned beans seemed like a gourmet feast when eaten by firelight with the stars emerging overhead. "Now for the main event," Robert announced, producing a bag of marshmallows with the flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick. The s'mores making became a ceremony of its own, with each family member developing their own technique for achieving the perfect balance of toasted marshmallow, melted chocolate, and graham cracker crunch. Timothy discovered that he preferred his marshmallows burnt to charcoal, while Emma favored the golden brown perfection that required patience and careful rotation over the coals. "These are the best s'mores in the history of s'mores," Emma declared, chocolate smeared across her chin like war paint. "I think you might be right," Diana agreed, laughing as Timothy attempted to eat a particularly unwieldy creation that threatened to collapse with each bite. For a magical stretch of time, They were simply a family enjoying each other's company around a campfire. The problems that had driven them to this remote corner of Vermont seemed as distant as the city lights that no longer competed with the stars overhead. Timothy felt a contentment so complete that he wanted to capture it somehow, to bottle this moment and save it for the dark days that inevitably seemed to follow any happiness in the Walsh household. But as the fire began to burn low and the night air grew cold enough to send them toward their sleeping bags, Robert made an announcement that shattered the evening's perfection like a rock through glass. "I am going to get some more firewood," he said, standing and brushing ash from his hands, "and maybe grab something from the truck." Timothy saw his mother's face change in the firelight, saw hope crumble into the familiar expression of resignation and dread. Diana had learned to read her husband's coded language as fluently as Timothy had learned to read the spaces between his parents' words. "Robert, you promised?" Diana said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 100 broken promises that had come before this one. "I am just getting firewood," Robert replied. But Timothy could hear the defensiveness creeping into his father's tone. "The fire is dying, and it is going to get cold tonight." "The fire is fine," Diana said, standing to face her husband across the glowing coals. "And you know that is not what I am talking about." Emma looked back and forth between her parents with the wide-eyed alertness of a child who had learned to sense approaching storms. Timothy felt his stomach clench with the familiar dread that preceded his parents' arguments, the sick feeling that always accompanied the moment when their carefully constructed normalcy began to crack. "Diana, do not start this," Robert warned, his voice taking on the hard edge that meant he was already preparing for battle. "I have had a perfect day with my family, and I am not going to let you ruin it with your suspicions and accusations." "I am not trying to ruin anything," Diana replied, her voice rising despite her obvious effort to remain calm. "I am trying to save it. I am trying to save us." Robert walked toward his truck with the determined stride of a man who had already made his decision. Timothy heard the distinctive sound of the truck's tailgate opening, followed by the rustle of something being moved around in the truck bed. When his father returned to the fire, he carried an armload of firewood in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. "Robert, no," Diana pleaded. "You promised the children. You promised me." "One drink," Robert said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone that Timothy had learned to hate. "Just one drink to help me relax. It has been a stressful week, and I deserve to unwind a little." "It is never just one drink," Diana replied, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "It has never been just one drink, not in the past 3 years." "Do not lecture me about drinking," Robert snapped, the bottle already half open in his hands. "I work my ass off to provide for this family, and if I want to have a drink around my own campfire, I am going to have a drink." Emma moved closer to Timothy, instinctively seeking the comfort of shared fear. Timothy put his arm around his sister, feeling her tremble against his side. They had witnessed this scene too many times before, but somehow it felt worse here in the wilderness, surrounded by darkness and isolated from any possibility of help or intervention. "Your own campfire?" Diana's voice rose to match her husband's volume. "This is supposed to be our family campfire. This was supposed to be our chance to be a family again." "We are a family," Robert said, taking his first drink directly from the bottle. "This does not change that." But Timothy could see that it changed everything. With each sip his father took, the man who had taught him to tie knots and identify trees disappeared, replaced by the stranger who had been living in their house for so long that Timothy sometimes forgot what his real father looked like. The argument escalated with the terrible predictability of a natural disaster. Diana pleaded and Robert defended, their voices growing louder and more bitter as the whiskey level in the bottle dropped. Timothy tried to shelter Emma from the worst of it, humming quietly in her ear and trying to focus on the sound of the stream rather than the sound of his family falling apart. "I cannot do this anymore," Diana finally said, her voice breaking with exhaustion and grief. "I cannot keep pretending that everything is going to be okay. I cannot keep lying to the children about who you have become." "Then do not," Robert snarled, draining the bottle with the aggressive thirst of a man trying to drown something that refused to die. "Nobody is forcing you to stay married to me. Nobody is forcing you to be here. You are right, Diana said with a finality that made Timothy's blood turn to ice water. Nobody is forcing me. What happened next unfolded with the surreal quality of a nightmare. Robert, drunk and enraged, announced that the camping trip was over, that he was driving back to town immediately. Despite Diana's pleas about the dangers of drunk driving on mountain roads in the dark, he stumbled toward his truck with the single-minded determination of a man who had lost the ability to hear reason. "Robert, please," Diana begged, following him toward the truck. "If you have to go, let me drive. Think about the children." "I am thinking about the children," Robert slurred, fumbling with his keys. "I am thinking about how they deserve better than this. Better than me." The truck roared to life with a sound that seemed to tear through the peaceful mountain night like a chainsaw. Robert backed out of their campsite with reckless speed, gravel spraying from beneath his tires as he disappeared down the dark road toward the main highway. Diana stood in the truck's fading taillights, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. After a moment, she turned back toward Timothy and Emma, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "I have to go after him," she said, her voice hollow with desperation. "I have to try to stop him before he kills himself or someone else." "Mom, do not leave us here," Emma pleaded, her voice high and thin with panic. "I will be back by morning," Diana promised, kneeling to gather both children in a fierce embrace. "I promise you, I will be back by morning. Stay at the campsite, do not go wandering around in the dark, and keep the fire going. Can you do that for me?" Timothy nodded, though every instinct in his body screamed against letting his mother disappear into the darkness. At 9 years old, he was being asked to become the adult, to take care of his sister and keep them both safe in a wilderness that suddenly seemed vast and threatening. Diana kissed both children goodbye with the desperate intensity of a mother who was not sure she would see them again. Then she grabbed a flashlight and set off down the gravel road on foot, following the path her husband's truck had taken toward what might be salvation or might be disaster. Timothy and Emma sat beside the dying fire, listening to their mother's footsteps fade into the mountain silence. The woods around them seemed to grow larger and darker with each passing minute, full of sounds they could not identify and dangers they could not name. "She will come back, right?" Emma whispered, her hand finding Timothy's in the flickering firelight. "She will come back," Timothy replied with a conviction he did not feel. "She promised." But as the night deepened around them and the fire burned lower despite Timothy's efforts to keep it alive, both children began to understand that promises in the Walsh family had become as fragile as autumn leaves, beautiful for a moment but destined to crumble at the first touch of reality. Above them, the stars that had seemed so magical just hours before now looked cold and distant, indifferent witnesses to two children learning that sometimes the people you love most are the ones who hurt you deepest, and that growing up can happen in a single night when you are not ready and the world does not care whether you are prepared for what comes next. Sunday morning arrived with the cruel indifference of nature to human suffering. The sun rose over Pine Ridge Campground with the same golden magnificence it had displayed the day before, painting the autumn leaves in brilliant reds and golds as if nothing had changed, as if two children had not spent the night huddled together beside a dying fire, jumping at every sound the forest made in the darkness. Timothy woke first, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground outside their tent. He had insisted they sleep in the open air so they could watch for their mother's return, though Emma had fallen into an exhausted sleep around 3 in the morning. The fire had died to cold ashes hours ago, despite Timothy's best efforts to keep it alive with the limited firewood his father had gathered before everything fell apart. The silence was absolute except for the gentle babbling of the stream and the morning chorus of birds that seemed to mock the heaviness in Timothy's chest. He sat up carefully, trying not to wake Emma, and looked down the gravel road that led to the main highway. There was no sign of his mother returning, no sound of footsteps or voices calling their names. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a green and gold ocean that had swallowed his parents without a trace. Timothy studied his sister's sleeping face, noting the way her breathing was slightly irregular even in sleep. Emma had always been the stronger one, the leader, the one who made decisions when their parents were too lost in their own problems to notice what their children needed. But now, in the gray morning light, she looked younger than her 12 years, vulnerable in a way that made Timothy's chest tight with protective fear. Emma stirred beside him, her face pale in the early morning light. Even in sleep, she looked worried. Her small hands clutched into fists as if she were fighting battles in her dreams. When she opened her eyes and saw Timothy watching her, the hope that flickered there for just a moment before being extinguished by memory nearly broke his heart. "She did not come back," Emma said quietly, her voice hoarse from crying and the cold mountain air. "She will come back," Timothy replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Maybe she found Dad and they are working things out. Maybe they stayed in town to get help." Emma sat up, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The morning air carried the sharp bite of autumn in the mountains, and Timothy could see their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. What if something bad happened to them? What if Dad crashed the truck? What if Mom got lost trying to find him? Timothy did not have an answer for those questions, because the same fears had been growing in his chest since the moment he woke up. In the daylight, their situation seemed even more precarious than it had in the darkness. They were 15 miles from the nearest town, with no way to contact anyone, no adults to help them, and no idea when or if their parents would return. "Let us eat something," Timothy said, forcing himself to sound more confident than he felt. "Mom packed plenty of food, and we need to keep our strength up." They ate peanut butter sandwiches and drank water from their bottles, trying to make breakfast feel normal even though nothing about their situation was normal. Emma's appetite was poor, and Timothy noticed she was breathing with the slight wheeze that usually preceded her asthma attacks. The stress and cold air were not helping her condition, and Timothy felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. "I keep thinking about last night," Emma said, staring into the cold ashes of their campfire. "The way Dad looked when he was drinking. He was not really Dad anymore, was he? He was someone else wearing Dad's face." Timothy nodded, understanding exactly what his sister meant. "I think the real Dad is still in there somewhere. I think that is why Mom went after him. She is trying to find the real Dad and bring him back." "But what if she cannot find him?" Emma's voice was small and frightened. "What if the real Dad is gone forever?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from their dead fire. Timothy had been wondering the same thing for months, watching his father disappear piece by piece into the bottle, leaving behind a stranger who wore his clothes and slept in his bed but did not remember how to be a father. "I want to go home," Emma said, her voice small and defeated. "We will go home," Timothy promised. "But we need to wait for Mom and Dad to come back for us." As the morning progressed and there was still no sign of their parents, Timothy began to wrestle with a terrible decision. Every instinct told him to stay at the campsite and wait for rescue, but another part of him was beginning to wonder if rescue was coming at all. What if their father had crashed the truck? What if their mother was hurt and unable to make it back to them? What if they were going to be stuck here until someone else came to the campground and found them? The thought of other campers finding them was both hopeful and terrifying. How would they explain what had happened? How would they tell strangers that their father had abandoned them while drunk and their mother had disappeared trying to save him? The shame of their family's dysfunction felt almost as heavy as the fear of being alone in the wilderness. "I cannot just sit here anymore," Emma announced around 11 in the morning, her voice carrying a forced brightness that Timothy recognized as her way of dealing with fear. "I feel like I am going crazy just waiting and waiting." "What do you want to do?" Timothy asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "I want to explore a little bit," Emma said. "Maybe I can find some of those interesting rocks like yesterday. Maybe I can find a high place where I can see if Mom and Dad are coming back." "Emma, Mom said to stay at the campsite," Timothy reminded her, though he understood her need to do something, anything, to distract from the growing dread that seemed to be consuming them both. "I will just go to that rocky area we saw yesterday," Emma insisted. "The one with the big cliff. It is not that far and I can still see the campsite from there. Maybe from up high I can see the road better. See if there are any cars coming." Timothy felt torn between his protective instincts and his understanding of his sister's need for action. Emma had always been the adventurous one, the child who climbed trees and explored creek beds, while Timothy preferred books and quiet activities. But she was also the one with asthma, the one who needed to be careful about overexertion and stress. "If you go, I am going with you," Timothy said finally. "You do not have to babysit me," Emma replied with a flash of her old spirit. "I can take care of myself." "I know you can," Timothy said gently. "But I want to come with you anyway. We should stick together." Emma looked at her brother for a long moment, and Timothy saw something shift in her expression. "You are right," she said quietly. "We only have each other right now. We need to stick together." They packed water bottles and some trail mix, leaving a note at their campsite in case their parents returned while they were gone. Timothy felt ridiculous writing "gone to explore the rocks back soon" on a piece of paper torn from Emma's notebook, but it seemed like the responsible thing to do. The note made their absence seem temporary and innocent, though Timothy could not shake the feeling that they were making a mistake. They set off together through the pine forest, following a faint trail that wound upward toward the rocky outcrop Emma had noticed the day before. The trail was steeper than it had appeared from a distance, and Timothy found himself breathing hard as they climbed. Emma, despite her asthma, seemed energized by the physical activity, and Timothy wondered if she was trying to prove something to herself or to him. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of autumn, leaves rustling in the breeze, squirrels chattering as they gathered acorns, and the distant call of birds migrating south for the winter. Under different circumstances, Timothy would have found the hike peaceful and beautiful. But with every step they took away from their campsite, he felt increasingly anxious, as if they were walking away from safety into unknown danger. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, noticing Timothy's labored breathing. "I am fine," Timothy replied, though he was not sure that was true. "Just not used to hiking uphill." "We can rest if you need to," Emma offered, though Timothy could see she was eager to keep moving. "No, I am okay. Let us keep going." The rocky area, when they reached it after 45 minutes of steady climbing, was even more impressive than it had appeared from their campsite. A granite cliff face rose nearly 50 feet above them, carved by centuries of weather into dramatic formations that looked like something from a fantasy movie. The rock was dotted with crevices and ledges that seemed to invite exploration, and Timothy could see why Emma had been drawn to this place. "Look at all those handholds," Emma said, her eyes bright with excitement. "I bet I could climb pretty high up there, maybe high enough to see the road, to see if Mom and Dad are coming back." "Emma, no," Timothy said immediately, alarm bells ringing in his head. "That looks dangerous, and you know what Mom says about your asthma and climbing." "My asthma is fine," Emma insisted, though Timothy could hear the slight wheeze in her voice that suggested otherwise. "And I am not going to climb the whole thing, just high enough to get a good view of the area." "Please do not," Timothy pleaded. "What if you fall? What if you have an asthma attack? I cannot help you if you get hurt." Emma turned to look at her brother, and Timothy saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before, a desperate need to prove that she was not helpless, that she could do something brave and important even when everything else in her world was falling apart. "I need to do this, Timmy," she said quietly. "I need to do something that makes me feel strong. I need to feel like I can take care of us, like I can figure out how to get us home." Timothy understood that feeling, even if he could not share it. Emma had always been the one who took charge, who made decisions and led the way. She was the one who helped him with his homework, who stood up to bullies at school, who made sure he had lunch money when their parents forgot. The helplessness of their situation was eating at her in ways that were different from how it affected him. While Timothy's instinct was to hunker down and wait for rescue, Emma's was to take action, to do something that would give her a sense of control. "Just promise me you will be careful," Timothy said, knowing that he could not stop his sister once she had made up her mind. "And promise me you will come down if you feel your asthma acting up." "I promise," Emma said, giving him a quick hug before turning toward the cliff face. "And I promise I will not go too high, just high enough to see if I can spot the road." Timothy watched with growing anxiety as his sister began to climb. Emma was a natural athlete despite her asthma, and she moved up the rock face with a grace that reminded Timothy of the squirrels that played in the trees around their house. She tested each handhold carefully, making sure it was secure before putting her weight on it, and she moved with deliberate precision that showed she was taking the climb seriously. For the first 20 feet or so, she climbed easily, finding handholds and footholds with the instinctive skill of a child who had spent her life exploring the world around her. Timothy felt his heart hammering in his chest, but he had to admit that Emma looked comfortable and confident on the rock face. "I can see for miles from up here," Emma called down, her voice echoing off the rock face. "The whole valley looks like a painting. I can see our campsite, and I can see the road that leads to the highway. Can you see any cars?" Timothy called up. "Not yet," Emma replied, "but the view is getting better the higher I go. I think I can see even more if I go just a little bit higher." Timothy felt his anxiety increasing as he watched his sister climb higher. She was now 30 feet above the ground, far higher than he had ever seen her climb before. The rock face was steep, and Timothy could see that the handholds were becoming smaller and more widely spaced the higher she went. "Emma, that is high enough," Timothy called up. "You proved you could do it. Now come down and tell me what you saw." "Just a little higher," Emma replied, her voice sounding strained from the effort of climbing. "I think I see a ledge up there that will give me a perfect view of the whole area." Timothy could hear the wheeze in her voice becoming more pronounced, and he knew that the combination of physical exertion and stress was triggering her asthma. "Emma, you are starting to wheeze. You need to come down now and use your inhaler." "I am fine," Emma insisted, though Timothy could see that her movements were becoming less fluid, more labored. "Just give me a few more minutes. I think I can see something moving on the road." "Emma, please," Timothy begged, his voice cracking with fear. "You are scaring me. Please come down." But Emma was focused on the ledge above her, determined to reach it despite the increasing difficulty of the climb. Timothy watched in growing horror as his sister pushed herself beyond her limits, her breathing becoming more and more labored with each foot she climbed. What happened next unfolded with the terrible slow-motion clarity that comes with witnessing a disaster you are powerless to prevent. Emma reached for a hand-hold that looked solid from below but crumbled under her weight. Timothy heard the sound of breaking rock, followed by his sister's cry of surprise and fear. "Timmy!" Emma screamed as she felt herself falling. Emma tried to catch herself, her fingers scrambling for purchase on the granite face. But the rock was too smooth and she was too far from the secure holds below. Timothy watched in absolute horror as his sister fell, her body tumbling through the air for what seemed like an eternity before she hit the rocky ground below with a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The sound was not like anything Timothy had ever heard before, a wet, horrible thud that seemed to echo off the cliff face and reverberate through his entire body. It was the sound of his sister's body hitting solid granite from a height of nearly 40 feet, and Timothy knew immediately that something terrible had happened. "Emma!" Timothy screamed, running to where his sister lay motionless on the granite slab at the base of the cliff. She was unconscious, her face pale and still, with a thin trickle of blood running from her left ear. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and Timothy could see that her left arm was bent at an unnatural angle. But it was the blood from her ear that terrified him most, because he remembered his mother talking about head injuries and how blood from the ears was a sign of something very serious. "Emma, please wake up," Timothy whispered, kneeling beside his sister and afraid to touch her for fear of making her injuries worse. "Please be okay. Please do not leave me alone." But Emma did not wake up. Her breathing continued, but it was labored and irregular, and Timothy could see that she was deeply unconscious in a way that was not like normal sleep. Her face was deathly pale except for a dark bruise that was already forming on her forehead, and Timothy could see that there was more blood than just what was coming from her ear. Timothy checked her pulse the way his mother had taught him, pressing his fingers against her wrist until he found the fluttering rhythm of her heartbeat. It was fast and weak, but it was there. He tried to remember everything his mother had ever told him about first aid, but his mind felt blank with panic and fear. "Think, Timothy, think," he whispered to himself, trying to push down the terror that threatened to overwhelm him. "What would Mom do? What would she tell you to do?" The first thing he remembered was to make sure Emma was breathing. He could see her chest rising and falling, but her breathing was shallow and irregular. He wanted to turn her on her side in case she vomited, but he was terrified that moving her might make her injuries worse if she had hurt her back or neck. Timothy sat back on his heels, his mind racing as he tried to process what had happened and what he needed to do. They were 15 miles from help, with no way to contact anyone, and his sister was seriously injured and unconscious. His parents were gone, and there was no one else who even knew where they were. The weight of the situation settled on Timothy's shoulders like a physical force. At 9 years old, he was the only person who could save his sister's life, and he had no idea how to do it. He was not strong enough to carry her, and he was not sure he could find his way back to civilization even if he could. But as Timothy knelt beside his unconscious sister, listening to her labored breathing and feeling more alone than he had ever felt in his life, he realized that he did have one option. It would be the hardest thing he had ever done, maybe the hardest thing anyone had ever done, but it was the only chance Emma had. He was going to have to get her to help, somehow, even if it meant dragging her 15 miles through the Vermont wilderness to reach the nearest town. The thought was so overwhelming that Timothy felt dizzy, but when he looked at Emma's pale face and heard her struggling to breathe, he knew he had no choice. "I am going to get you out of here," Timothy whispered to his unconscious sister. "I do not know how, but I am going to get you home. I am going to save you, Emma. I promise." Timothy spent the next hour making multiple trips back to their campsite, gathering everything he thought he might need for the impossible journey ahead. He packed all their food and water, grabbed their sleeping bags and extra clothes, and most importantly, he collected the tent poles and tarps that he would need to construct a makeshift stretcher. The work was exhausting, made worse by the constant fear that Emma might die while he was away from her. Each time he returned to the cliff face, he expected to find that she had stopped breathing, but each time she was still alive, still fighting, still giving him a reason to keep going. Building the stretcher was the most difficult thing Timothy had ever attempted. He had watched his father work with tools and materials, but he had never tried to build anything himself. The tent poles were designed to fit together in specific ways, and the tarps had grommets and ties that were meant to secure the tent fabric, not to hold the weight of a person. Timothy worked with desperate determination, using the knots his father had taught him just 2 days ago. The bowline knot, his father had said, was one of the most important knots a man could know. Timothy had never imagined he would need to use it to save his sister's life. "Every man should know how to tie a proper bowline," Timothy whispered, repeating his father's words as he struggled with the ropes. "My father taught me when I was about your age, and his father taught him." The memory of his father's hands guiding his through the motions of the knot gave Timothy strength, reminding him that even though his father had failed them in so many ways, he had also given Timothy tools that might save Emma's life. When the stretcher was finally ready, Timothy faced the most difficult task of all, moving Emma onto it without causing further injury. He had heard his mother talk about spinal injuries and the importance of not moving someone who might have hurt their back or neck, but he also knew that Emma would die if she did not get medical attention soon. "I am sorry if this hurts," Timothy whispered as he carefully, gently, moved his sister onto the improvised stretcher. Emma remained unconscious throughout the process, which Timothy took as both a blessing and a terrifying sign of how seriously she was injured. He wrapped her in sleeping bags to keep her warm and to cushion her body against the jolting that was inevitable during the journey ahead. He put her inhaler in her jacket pocket, along with the little stuffed bear she had slept with since she was small. If Emma woke up during the journey, Timothy wanted her to have something familiar to comfort her. With Emma secured on the stretcher, Timothy looked back toward their campsite, then toward the distant road that represented their only hope of survival. 15 miles had never seemed so far, and Timothy had never felt so small. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, and Timothy had only a vague idea of which direction would lead them back to civilization. But Emma was counting on him, even if she did not know it, and Timothy had learned from his father that sometimes a man had to do impossible things when the people he loved were in danger. He thought about all the times Emma had taken care of him, all the ways she had protected him and helped him when their parents were too lost in their own problems to notice what their children needed. Now it was his turn to take care of her. Timothy took hold of the ropes he had attached to the front of the stretcher, said a prayer to whatever force governed the universe of 9-year-old boys and unconscious sisters, and began the longest walk of his life. The forest seemed to swallow them as they left the rocky outcrop behind, and Timothy could not shake the feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. But every time he looked back at Emma's pale face and heard her labored breathing, he knew that staying put and hoping for rescue was not an option. Emma needed help now, and Timothy was the only person in the world who could get it for her. The stretcher was heavier than Timothy had expected, and the forest floor was rough and uneven, full of rocks and roots that made dragging the stretcher difficult and jarring. Within the first 100 yards, Timothy was already breathing hard and sweating despite the cool mountain air. "This is going to be harder than I thought," Timothy whispered to himself, stopping to rest and to check on Emma. She was still unconscious, still breathing, but Timothy could see that the jolting motion of the stretcher was not good for her injuries. He adjusted the sleeping bags around her, trying to provide more cushioning, and he checked the ropes that held the stretcher together. Everything seemed secure, but Timothy knew that 15 miles of this rough treatment would test every knot and every joint in his improvised construction. "We can do this," Timothy said to his unconscious sister. "We have to do this." Step by step, foot by foot, Timothy began dragging his sister toward what he hoped would be salvation, carrying with him the desperate hope that love and determination could overcome the impossible odds stacked against two children alone in the wilderness. Behind them, the mountains rose in silent judgment, indifferent to the small drama of human courage playing out in their shadow. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains when Timothy finally stopped for the night, exhausted and discouraged by how little progress he had made. He estimated that they had traveled less than 2 miles from the rocky outcrop, which meant they still had more than 12 miles to go. At this rate, it would take them a week to reach help, and Timothy knew that Emma did not have a week. But there was nothing to do except rest and try again in the morning. Timothy made a small fire and ate one of their remaining sandwiches, saving most of their food for the difficult days ahead. He slept fitfully beside Emma, waking every few hours to check her breathing and to make sure she was still alive. In the morning, they would continue their impossible journey, two children alone in the wilderness, racing against time and the limits of human endurance to reach salvation before it was too late. The second day of Timothy's impossible journey began before dawn, when the forest was still shrouded in the gray half-light that comes before sunrise. He had slept fitfully beside Emma, waking every hour to check her breathing and to stoke the small fire he had built to keep them warm through the cold mountain night. Each time he woke, his first terrifying thought was that Emma might have stopped breathing, but each time he found her chest still rising and falling with the shallow, irregular rhythm that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The mountain air had grown cold during the night, cold enough that Timothy could see his breath in small puffs when he exhaled. He had covered Emma with every piece of spare clothing they possessed, layering sleeping bags and jackets over her unconscious form until she looked like a small mountain of fabric. But despite his efforts, he could see that her lips had taken on a slightly blue tinge that made his stomach clench with fear. Emma had not regained consciousness during the night, and Timothy was beginning to understand that this was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because she was not in pain, not aware of their desperate situation, not frightened by the magnitude of what lay ahead. A curse because her continued unconsciousness meant that her injuries were serious, possibly life-threatening, and that time was running out faster than Timothy had hoped. "Good morning, Emma," Timothy whispered as he knelt beside the stretcher, his voice hoarse from the cold air. "I know you cannot hear me, but I wanted you to know that we are going to make it. I am going to get you home." Timothy ate a breakfast of stale crackers and lukewarm water from his bottle, trying to conserve their supplies while maintaining his strength for the grueling day ahead. He had rationed their food carefully, calculating that they had enough for perhaps 3 more days if he ate very little and saved most of it for Emma in case she woke up. The hunger gnawing at his stomach was becoming constant now, but Timothy pushed it aside as he had learned to push aside so many other discomforts. He estimated that they had traveled less than 2 miles the previous day, which meant they still had more than 13 miles to go before they reached the main road that led to Millbrook. At yesterday's pace, it would take them nearly a week to reach help, and Timothy knew with the certainty of a child who had watched his mother work as a nurse that Emma did not have a week. "We need to go faster today," Timothy whispered to his unconscious sister as he checked the ropes that secured her to the makeshift stretcher. I know it is going to be rough, but we have to cover more ground if we are going to get you to a doctor in time. The stretcher had held up remarkably well through the first day's journey, though Timothy could see stress fractures in some of the tent poles and places where the tarp was beginning to wear thin from being dragged over rocks and roots. He reinforced the weak spots with duct tape from their camping supplies, working by the light of his small flashlight to make repairs that he hoped would last through the difficult terrain ahead. Timothy had become something of an expert on the construction of his improvised stretcher, learning through necessity which knots held best under stress and which parts of the frame were most likely to fail. He adjusted the distribution of Emma's weight, repositioning the sleeping bags to provide better support for her injured body, and he triple-checked every connection point to make sure nothing would come apart during the day's journey. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber, Timothy extinguished his fire and prepared to resume their journey. He had studied the hand-drawn map Frank had given them at the campground registration, trying to memorize the route that would take them back to the main road. The problem was that the map showed the official trails and roads, not the rough cross-country route Timothy was forced to take while dragging an injured person on a homemade stretcher. Timothy had decided to follow the stream that ran near their campsite, reasoning that water always flowed downhill toward larger bodies of water, which were more likely to be near roads and towns. It was not a perfect plan, but it was better than wandering aimlessly through the forest and hoping to stumble upon civilization. His father had once told him that lost hikers should follow water downstream, and Timothy clung to this piece of paternal wisdom like a lifeline. Dad taught me that water always knows the way to civilization, Timothy said to Emma as he began the day's journey. He said that rivers and streams are like roads that lead to people. I hope he was right about that. The stream bed provided easier travel than the dense forest, but it came with its own challenges. The ground was often muddy and unstable, causing the stretcher to sink and stick in places where Timothy had to use all his strength to pull it free. Rocks and fallen branches created obstacles that required careful navigation, and several times Timothy had to lift one end of the stretcher to maneuver around impediments that he could not simply drag over. The constant tugging and pulling was taking a toll on Timothy's small body. His shoulders burned with fatigue, and his back ached from the awkward posture required to drag the stretcher efficiently. But it was his hands that suffered most. Despite the work gloves he had found in their camping supplies, his palms were raw and blistered from gripping the ropes hour after hour. By mid-morning, Timothy's hands were bleeding inside the gloves, leaving dark stains on the rope handles. He tried wrapping his hands with strips of cloth torn from a spare t-shirt, but the makeshift bandages quickly became soaked with blood and had to be changed frequently. The pain was constant now, a sharp burning sensation that flared with every step, but Timothy gritted his teeth and continued forward. Tell me about the dollhouse Dad built you, Timothy said to his unconscious sister as they moved through a particularly beautiful section of forest where the autumn leaves created a canopy of red and gold overhead. Tell me about all the tiny furniture and the little family that lived there. Timothy had discovered that talking to Emma helped him cope with the loneliness and fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He told her stories about their happier times, reminded her of family vacations and birthday parties and Christmas mornings when their parents had still been the people they were supposed to be. He did not know if Emma could hear him, but the sound of his own voice kept him company and gave him something to focus on besides the pain in his hands and the seemingly endless forest ahead. Remember when Mom used to make those special pancakes on Sunday mornings? Timothy continued, carefully guiding the stretcher around a fallen log. The ones shaped like Mickey Mouse with chocolate chips for eyes? You always complained that yours did not look exactly like Mickey Mouse, but you ate them anyway because they tasted so good. The memories were both comforting and heartbreaking, reminders of the family they had once been before alcohol and financial stress and accumulated disappointments had transformed their parents into strangers. Timothy wondered if they would ever be that family again, or if those happy memories were all they would have left of the people their parents used to be. Mom used to sing while she made those pancakes, Timothy continued, his voice growing soft with remembrance. She had this song about sunshine and morning glories, and she would dance around the kitchen while the batter was cooking. You used to try to sing along, but you never could remember all the words. As the morning progressed, Timothy began to notice changes in the forest around them. The trees were growing smaller and more widely spaced, and he could see patches of sky through the canopy that had been completely hidden the day before. The stream was running faster now, tumbling over rocks and creating small waterfalls that filled the air with the musical sound of rushing water. These changes gave Timothy hope that they were moving in the right direction, that the stream was indeed leading them toward lower elevations where civilization was more likely to exist. But the increasingly rough terrain was making their progress more difficult, and Timothy found himself having to navigate around obstacles that would have been impossible to overcome while dragging an injured person. "I think we are getting close to something," Timothy told Emma as they rested beside a particularly large boulder that provided some shelter from the wind. "The forest is changing, and I can hear different sounds. I think there might be a road nearby." Timothy was learning to read the wilderness in ways he had never imagined possible. He could tell time by the position of the sun filtering through the leaves, judge direction by the way moss grew on tree trunks, and predict the weather by the behavior of the birds and small animals they encountered. These were skills his father had tried to teach him during their rare outdoor adventures, but Timothy had never paid close attention. Now, with Emma's life depending on his ability to navigate through the wilderness, every lesson came flooding back with crystal clarity. As the day progressed, Timothy fell into a rhythm of movement that was almost meditative. Pull the stretcher forward for 20 or 30 feet, stop to rest and check on Emma, adjust the sleeping bags around her to make sure she was warm and comfortable, then continue forward. The repetitive nature of the work allowed his mind to wander, and he found himself thinking about things he had never considered before. He thought about what it meant to be responsible for another person's life, about the weight of making decisions that could determine whether someone lived or died. At 9 years old, Timothy was learning lessons about courage and sacrifice that most adults never faced, and he was discovering reserves of strength within himself that he had never known existed. "I used to think Dad was the strongest person in the world," Timothy said to Emma as they rested beside the stream during what he estimated was the hottest part of the day. "Remember how he could lift both of us at the same time? Remember how he could fix anything that was broken?" Timothy splashed cool water on his face and hands, trying to wash away some of the sweat and grime that had accumulated during their journey. The water was clear and cold, and Timothy found himself thinking about how different this stream looked from the polluted creek that ran behind their house in Millbrook. Here, in the wilderness, everything seemed cleaner and more honest, as if the natural world had not yet learned how to lie to itself the way people did. "But I think maybe being strong is not about how much you can lift," Timothy continued, his voice growing thoughtful. "Maybe it is about how much you can carry inside yourself. Maybe it is about not giving up when everything seems impossible." The realization surprised Timothy with its clarity. He had always admired physical strength, had always wanted to be big and powerful like his father had once been. But dragging Emma through the wilderness was teaching him that true strength came from somewhere deeper than muscles and bones. It came from love, from determination, from the simple refusal to give up when giving up would be the easiest thing in the world. The afternoon brought new challenges as the stream led them into a section of forest where the trees grew thick and the underbrush was dense with thorny bushes and tangled vines. Timothy had to hack through some of the vegetation with a camp hatchet, creating a path wide enough for the stretcher while trying not to jostle Emma too much. The work was exhausting, and Timothy's progress slowed to a crawl as he fought his way through the wilderness. "This would be easier if you were awake to help," Timothy said to Emma with a tired smile. "You always were better at figuring out the best way through difficult places." It was true. Emma had always been the navigator in their family, the one who could read maps and find shortcuts and somehow always know which direction was home. Timothy had relied on his sister's sense of direction so many times that he felt lost without her guidance, not just physically but emotionally as well. The thorny undergrowth tore at Timothy's clothes and scratched his arms and face, leaving him looking like he had been in a fight with a very large and very angry cat. But he pressed forward, hacking and pulling and dragging the stretcher inch by inch through vegetation that seemed determined to keep them trapped forever. "Remember when we got lost in the woods behind the Hendersons' house?" Timothy asked Emma as he wrestled with a particularly stubborn vine. "We were maybe 6 and 9, and we had been exploring for hours when we realized we did not know which way was home. I started to cry, but you just looked around for a minute and then pointed toward that big oak tree and said home was that way. And you were right. You were always right about directions. The memory made Timothy smile despite their desperate circumstances. Emma had possessed an almost supernatural ability to find her way through unfamiliar territory, a skill that had saved them from minor disasters more times than Timothy could count. Now, when he needed that skill more than ever, Emma was unconscious and unable to help him navigate through the maze of forest trails and stream beds that all looked the same to his inexperienced eyes. As evening approached, Timothy found himself facing a decision that would determine whether they survived the night. The stream had led them to a place where the water tumbled down a series of rocky ledges in what would have been a beautiful waterfall under different circumstances. The falling water created a fine mist that caught the late afternoon sunlight, painting rainbows in the air and filling the clearing with the thunderous sound of rushing water. But for Timothy, dragging an injured person on a makeshift stretcher, the waterfall represented an insurmountable obstacle. The rocky ledges were steep and irregular, with no clear path down to the bottom. He could not possibly carry Emma down the treacherous descent, and he could not drag the stretcher over the uneven stone ledges without risking serious injury to both of them. Timothy studied the terrain carefully, weighing his options while the sun sank lower toward the horizon. To the left of the waterfall, the forest looked dense and difficult, full of steep slopes and thick undergrowth that would make dragging the stretcher nearly impossible. To the right, the land appeared to rise more gradually, but Timothy could see that it would take them farther away from the stream that had been their guide and lifeline. "What would you do, Emma?" Timothy asked his unconscious sister, his voice barely audible over the sound of falling water. "Which way would you choose?" The decision felt impossibly heavy, weighted with consequences that could mean the difference between life and death. If Timothy chose wrong, they could become lost in the wilderness with no way to find their way back to the stream or to any other landmark. But if he stayed put, hoping for rescue that might never come, Emma would certainly die. As if in answer to his question, Timothy heard a sound that made his heart leap with hope. It was faint and distant, almost lost in the thunder of the waterfall, but unmistakable, the sound of a car engine, somewhere beyond the trees to the right of the waterfall. Timothy had not heard a motor vehicle since his father's truck had disappeared into the darkness 2 nights ago, and the sound was like music to his ears. "Do you hear that?" Timothy whispered excitedly to Emma, his voice cracking with emotion. "That is a car, which means there is a road over there. We are going to make it, Emma. We are going to get you help." Energized by this sign of civilization, Timothy began the difficult process of maneuvering the stretcher away from the stream and up the gradual slope toward where he had heard the car. The forest floor was covered with fallen leaves that made dragging easier in some places but treacherous in others, where the leaves hid rocks and roots that caught the stretcher runners and threatened to overturn the entire apparatus. The uphill grade required all of Timothy's remaining strength, and he found himself having to rest every few minutes to catch his breath and fight off the dizziness that came from exhaustion and dehydration. His water bottle was nearly empty, and Timothy knew he would have to find another source of fresh water soon or risk collapse from dehydration. The sound of the car had faded into silence, but Timothy clung to the hope that where there was one vehicle, there would be others. Roads meant people, and people meant help, and help meant that Emma might survive this nightmare that had begun with a family camping trip and turned into a test of everything Timothy thought he knew about love and courage and the limits of human endurance. As they climbed higher, Timothy began to notice other signs of human presence. There were stumps where trees had been cut, probably for timber, and he could see what looked like tire tracks in the soft earth where logging equipment had passed. These signs filled Timothy with hope, because they meant that people came to this area regularly, which increased the chances that someone would find them or that they would find their way to safety. "Look, Emma," Timothy said, pointing to a section of forest where the undergrowth had been cleared. "People have been working here. That means we are getting close to civilization." As darkness fell over the forest, Timothy made camp in a small clearing where the trees opened up enough to let him see the stars overhead. He built another small fire, using the last of their dry kindling, and ate a meager dinner of crackers and peanut butter. Their food supplies were running dangerously low, But Timothy tried not to think about what would happen if they did not reach help soon. The fire provided warmth and comfort, but it also highlighted just how alone they were in the vast wilderness. The flames created a small circle of light and safety, but beyond that circle lay endless darkness filled with unknown dangers. Timothy had never felt so small or so vulnerable, and he found himself jumping at every sound the forest made in the night. "Tomorrow we are going to find that road," Timothy promised Emma as he settled down beside her for the night. "Tomorrow we are going to find people who can help you get better." Emma's breathing had grown more labored during the day, and Timothy could see that the constant jostling of the stretcher was taking a toll on her injured body. Dark circles had appeared under her eyes, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that terrified Timothy more than he was willing to admit. The blood from her ear had dried, but Timothy could see fresh spots where new bleeding had started. "You have to hold on," Timothy whispered, taking his sister's limp hand in his own. "You have to keep fighting, because I cannot do this without you. I cannot go home and tell Mom that I let you die in the woods." Timothy tried to make himself comfortable on the hard ground, but sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined Emma stopping breathing while he slept, and he would jerk awake in panic to check on her. The responsibility of keeping another person alive was more exhausting than the physical labor of dragging the stretcher, and Timothy felt the weight of it pressing down on him like a physical force. The third day dawned gray and overcast, with a sharp wind that carried the promise of rain. Timothy's body ached in places he had never known could hurt, and his hands were so sore and blistered that he could barely grip the stretcher ropes. But Emma was still breathing, still fighting, and that gave Timothy the strength to continue. "Just one more day," Timothy told himself as he prepared to resume their journey. "Maybe just one more day and we will find help." Timothy had torn his spare shirt into strips and wrapped them around the rope handles to provide some cushioning for his raw hands. The makeshift padding helped a little, but within an hour of starting their day's journey, the cloth strips were soaked with blood and had to be changed. The uphill climb toward where Timothy hoped to find a road was even more difficult than he had expected. The grade was steeper than it had appeared the previous evening, and the stretcher seemed to grow heavier with each step. Timothy had to stop and rest every few minutes, gasping for breath in the thin mountain air and fighting the despair that threatened to overwhelm him. "Come on, Timothy," he whispered to himself during one of their rest stops. "Emma is counting on you. Mom and Dad are counting on you. You cannot give up now." But giving up seemed like such an attractive option. Timothy's entire body was screaming in protest, begging him to stop and rest and let someone else take responsibility for the impossible task he had undertaken. It would be so easy to simply lie down beside Emma and wait for whatever was going to happen. Instead, Timothy forced himself to his feet and took hold of the stretcher ropes once more. One step at a time, one foot in front of the other, one more yard closer to salvation. That was all he had to think about: the next step, the next few feet, the next small goal that would bring them closer to help. But just as Timothy was beginning to wonder if he had imagined the sound of the car, if his desperate hope had caused him to hear things that were not there, he crested a small hill and saw the most beautiful sight of his young life. There, not more than half a mile away, was a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through the forest like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. It was a real road with yellow lines painted down the center and everything, and Timothy could see telephone poles running alongside it, which meant there was electricity and communications and all the infrastructure of civilization. "Emma, look!" Timothy shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "There is the road. We found it. We are going to make it." The sight of the road gave Timothy a burst of energy he had not felt since the beginning of their journey. He could practically taste salvation, could imagine the moment when they would flag down a passing car and Emma would be rushed to a hospital where doctors could save her life. The final half-mile to the road was the longest and most difficult of their entire journey. Timothy's exhausted body protested every step, and the stretcher caught on every root and rock, as if the forest itself was trying to prevent them from reaching safety. But Timothy pushed forward with the single-minded determination of a child who had learned that sometimes the impossible was the only option available. The forest seemed to grow denser as they approached the road, as if nature was making one final attempt to keep them trapped in the wilderness. Thorny bushes tore at Timothy's clothes and scratched his face, while fallen branches blocked their path and forced him to find alternate routes that added precious minutes to their journey. Almost there, Emma, Timothy gasped as he dragged the stretcher through the final 100 yards of forest. Almost there. Just hold on a little longer. When the stretcher finally scraped against the asphalt of the road, Timothy collapsed to his knees beside Emma, too exhausted to celebrate but too relieved to despair. They had made it. After 3 days of dragging his unconscious sister through the Vermont wilderness, they had reached civilization. Now all Timothy had to do was find someone to help them, someone who could get Emma to a hospital before it was too late. The road stretched in both directions with no sign of traffic, but Timothy knew that cars used this road because he had heard one. All he had to do was wait, and eventually someone would come along and rescue them. "We did it, Emma," Timothy whispered, his voice barely audible with exhaustion. "We made it to the road. Now someone is going to help us, and you are going to be okay." But as Timothy sat beside his sister on the empty road, watching for any sign of approaching vehicles, he realized that their ordeal was not yet over. Getting to the road had been only the first part of their journey. Now they needed to find their way to a hospital, and they needed to do it quickly, because Emma's condition was clearly deteriorating. Timothy studied the road in both directions, trying to decide which way was more likely to lead to help. The pavement looked newer in one direction, and Timothy thought he could see what might be buildings in the distance, though it was hard to tell through the trees. In the other direction, the road seemed to curve back toward the mountains, which suggested it might lead away from populated areas. This way, Timothy decided, pointing toward what he hoped was civilization. This way looks like it goes toward town. Timothy took hold of the stretcher ropes one more time, summoning strength from reserves he did not know he possessed, and began dragging his sister down the asphalt road toward whatever lay ahead. The smooth pavement made dragging easier than the rough forest floor, but Timothy was so exhausted that even this relatively simple task felt monumental. Behind them, the wilderness watched in silence, having witnessed a demonstration of human courage that would become legend in the small towns and big cities, where people still believed that love could conquer the impossible. The forest had tested Timothy in ways he had never imagined possible, had pushed him beyond every limit he thought he possessed, and had discovered that sometimes the smallest among us are called upon to do the greatest things. Step by step, mile by mile, Timothy continued his march toward salvation, carrying with him the most precious cargo in the world and the unshakable faith that his 3 days in hell had not been in vain. Somewhere ahead lay help, lay doctors and hospitals and people who could save Emma's life. All Timothy had to do was keep moving, keep putting one foot in front of the other, keep believing that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but Timothy no longer saw it as an impossible distance. He saw it as a path to salvation, as the final chapter in a story that had begun with a broken family and would end with a miracle that no one would ever forget. The asphalt road that had seemed like salvation when Timothy first glimpsed it through the trees proved to be its own form of purgatory. The smooth surface made dragging the stretcher easier than navigating through the wilderness, but it also meant that Timothy could see exactly how far he still had to travel. The road stretched ahead of them like a black ribbon disappearing into the distance, with no sign of buildings, vehicles, or any other indication that civilization was nearby. Timothy had been walking down the center of the road for what felt like hours, though he had lost all sense of time during their 3-day ordeal. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, and Timothy could feel the heat beginning to build despite the cool mountain air. His legs felt like they were made of lead, and every step required a conscious effort of will that was becoming harder and harder to summon. "Just keep walking," Timothy whispered to himself, using the same mantra he had developed during their journey through the forest. "One step at a time. One foot in front of the other. Just keep walking." Emma's condition had continued to deteriorate during their time on the road. Her breathing had become more labored and irregular, and Timothy could see that her skin had taken on an alarming grayish pallor that made her look more like a corpse than a sleeping child. The sight terrified him, but he pushed his fear aside and focused on the simple task of moving forward. Timothy had wrapped his hands in every spare piece of cloth he could find, but the constant friction of the rope handles had worn through his makeshift bandages and reopened the wounds on his palms. Blood was seeping through the fabric wrappings, leaving dark stains on the stretcher ropes, but Timothy barely noticed the pain anymore. His entire world had narrowed to the rhythm of walking and the sound of the stretcher runners scraping against the asphalt. The road began to descend gradually, which gave Timothy hope that they were moving toward lower elevations where towns and cities were more likely to exist. But the downhill grade also made controlling the stretcher more difficult, as gravity wanted to pull it faster than Timothy could safely manage. Several times he had to dig in his heels and lean back against the weight to prevent the stretcher from running away from him. "Almost there, Emma," Timothy said, though he had no idea how much farther they had to go. "We are going to find help soon. Just hold on a little longer." The sound of his own voice was becoming strange to his ears, hoarse and weak from dehydration and exhaustion. Timothy's water bottle had been empty since the previous evening, and he was beginning to feel the effects of severe dehydration. His mouth felt like it was full of cotton, and his vision occasionally blurred in ways that made him stumble and nearly lose his grip on the stretcher. But just as Timothy was beginning to wonder if he would collapse before they found help, he heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle. Timothy looked up from the road surface where he had been focusing his attention and saw a pickup truck cresting a hill perhaps half a mile ahead of them. "Help!" Timothy screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Help us, please." The truck was still too far away for the driver to hear him, but Timothy began waving his arms frantically while continuing to drag the stretcher down the center of the road. He was terrified that the driver would not see them in time, or would assume they were just hitchhikers and drive past without stopping. As the truck drew closer, Timothy could see that it was an older model Ford with Vermont license plates, the kind of vehicle that might belong to a local farmer or construction worker. The driver was a middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap, and Timothy could see his expression change from casual interest to alarm as he realized that the small figure in the road was dragging what appeared to be an injured person on a makeshift stretcher. The truck screeched to a halt about 20 feet away from Timothy, and the driver jumped out with the quick movements of someone who had recognized an emergency. He was a tall, heavy-set man with graying hair and work clothes that suggested he was a laborer of some kind. But it was the expression of immediate concern and competence on his face that made Timothy's knees go weak with relief. "Jesus Christ, son, what happened?" the man asked as he ran toward Timothy and Emma. "Are you hurt? Is that your sister?" "She fell," Timothy gasped, his voice barely audible. "She fell from a cliff and she has been unconscious for 3 days. I dragged her here from the mountains. She needs a hospital. Please help her." The man knelt beside the stretcher and immediately began checking Emma's vital signs with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with injuries before. Timothy watched as the stranger's face grew grave, taking in Emma's pale complexion, her irregular breathing, and the dried blood around her ear. "My name is Bill McCarthy," the man said, looking up at Timothy with eyes full of compassion. "I am a volunteer EMT with the Millbrook Fire Department. We are going to get your sister to the hospital right now. But first I need to know your names and what exactly happened." "I am Timothy Walsh and this is my sister Emma," Timothy said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "We were camping with our parents at Pine Ridge, but our dad got drunk and left us, and our mom went after him and never came back. And Emma fell while she was climbing rocks and I had to drag her through the forest because there was no one else to help." Bill McCarthy's expression grew even more serious as he processed Timothy's explanation. "How long ago did this happen? When did your parents leave you?" 3 days ago, Timothy replied. "Saturday night our dad left, and Sunday morning Emma fell, and I have been dragging her ever since trying to get help." 3 days? Bill repeated, shaking his head in amazement. "Son, you dragged your sister 15 miles through the mountains in 3 days? Timothy nodded, suddenly feeling the full weight of what he had accomplished. "I could not leave her there. She would have died if I left her there." Bill carefully examined the stretcher that Timothy had constructed from camping equipment, noting the expert knots and the way the tarp had been rigged to distribute Emma's weight evenly. "This is incredible work," he said quietly. "You built this yourself?" "My dad taught me the knots," Timothy said. He taught me how to tie a bowline. Your dad taught you well, Bill said, carefully lifting Emma from the stretcher and carrying her toward his truck. We are going to put her in the back of my truck and drive straight to Millbrook General Hospital. It will be faster than waiting for an ambulance. Timothy followed Bill to the truck, his legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. After 3 days of being completely responsible for Emma's life, it felt surreal to have an adult taking charge, making decisions and knowing what to do. Bill had cushioned the truck bed with blankets and had positioned Emma so that her head was elevated and her airway was clear. He covered her with a heavy jacket and made sure she was secure for the ride to the hospital. Can you make it to the passenger seat? Bill asked Timothy. Or do you need me to carry you too? I can make it, Timothy said, though his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. The ride to Millbrook General Hospital was a blur of sirens and radio chatter, as Bill called ahead to alert the emergency room that they were bringing in a critical patient. Timothy sat in the passenger seat, watching familiar landmarks flash past the windows as they descended from the mountains toward the town where he had lived his entire life. You did an incredible thing, Bill said as they pulled into the hospital parking lot. I want you to know that what you did for your sister, most adults could not have done what you did. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos as Bill carried Emma through the automatic doors. Doctors and nurses surrounded them immediately, transferring Emma to a gurney and wheeling her toward the trauma bay while shouting medical terminology that Timothy did not understand. Timothy tried to follow, but a kind nurse gently guided him to a chair in the waiting area. Let the doctors work, she said softly. They are going to take excellent care of your sister. Is she going to be okay? Timothy asked, his voice small and frightened. The doctors are going to do everything they can, the nurse replied. But right now we need to take care of you too. When was the last time you ate or had something to drink? Timothy could not remember. The past 3 days had blurred together into an endless cycle of walking and dragging and checking on Emma. Food and water had become secondary to the simple goal of reaching help. The nurse brought Timothy sandwiches and juice, and he ate with the desperate hunger of someone who had been surviving on crackers and determination. As the immediate physical needs were addressed, Timothy began to process what was happening around him. Police officers had arrived and were asking questions about his parents and what had happened at the campground. Social workers were making phone calls and filling out forms. Everyone was very kind and very concerned, but Timothy felt overwhelmed by all the attention and all the questions. We need to contact your family, one of the social workers said gently. Do you have grandparents or other relatives we can call? My grandmother, Timothy said. My mom's mother. She lives here in Millbrook. Within an hour, Margaret Sullivan arrived at the hospital with tears streaming down her face, and her arms open to embrace the grandson she had not seen in months. Timothy collapsed into her embrace, finally allowing himself to cry as the weight of responsibility was lifted from his shoulders. Oh, Timothy, his grandmother whispered, holding him tight. Oh, my brave boy, what you have done is a miracle. Margaret Sullivan was a retired schoolteacher in her 60s, a woman who had raised 4 children and knew how to project calm competence even in the midst of crisis. She had always been the stable presence in Timothy and Emma's lives, the one adult who never seemed to be struggling with demons or drowning in problems too big to solve. Where are Mom and Dad? Timothy asked, pulling back to look at his grandmother's face. Margaret's expression grew pained, and Timothy immediately understood that the news was not good. Your father was found yesterday morning, she said gently. His truck went off the road about 3 miles from your campground. He did not survive the accident, Timothy. I am so sorry. The news hit Timothy like a physical blow, even though part of him had been preparing for it since the moment his father had driven away drunk into the mountain darkness. Robert Walsh had been disappearing piece by piece for years, but the finality of death was different from the gradual loss Timothy had been experiencing. What about Mom? Timothy asked, though he was afraid of the answer. Your mother is alive, Margaret said quickly. She was found by search teams yesterday, suffering from exposure and dehydration. She is in the hospital in Burlington, but she is going to be okay. She has been asking about you and Emma constantly. Timothy felt a complex mixture of relief and grief wash over him. His father was gone forever, but his mother was alive. Emma was getting the medical care she needed, but her condition was still uncertain. Their family had been shattered, but the pieces that remained might still be salvageable. Dr. Sarah Chun, the neurosurgeon who had been treating Emma, emerged from the operating room several hours later with news that Timothy had been praying to hear. The surgery went very well, she announced to the small group gathered in the waiting room. Emma had some bleeding in her brain and a few broken bones, but there does not appear to be any permanent damage. She should make a full recovery. Timothy felt his knees go weak with relief. After 3 days of carrying the terrible responsibility of keeping Emma alive, hearing that she was going to be okay seemed almost too good to be true. "Can I see her?" Timothy asked. "She is still unconscious from the anesthesia," Dr. Chun explained. "But you can sit with her if you would like. She should wake up in a few hours." Timothy sat beside Emma's hospital bed, holding her hand and watching the monitors that tracked her vital signs. She looked small and fragile, surrounded by all the medical equipment, but her color was better than it had been in days, and her breathing was strong and regular. "We made it," Timothy whispered to his sleeping sister. "We made it all the way home." Emma woke up gradually, her eyes fluttering open as the anesthesia wore off. The first thing she saw was Timothy's face, and she smiled despite the pain and confusion. "Timmy," she said weakly, "are we home?" "We are home," Timothy confirmed, squeezing her hand gently. "We are in the hospital in Millbrook. You have been asleep for a while." "I remember falling," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "I remember hitting the rocks, but everything after that is fuzzy." Timothy spent the next hour telling Emma about their journey through the forest, about the stretcher he had built and the 3 days they had spent walking toward civilization. Emma listened with growing amazement, occasionally reaching up to touch the bandages on Timothy's hands or the scratches on his face. "You carried me 15 miles?" Emma asked, her voice full of wonder. "You built a stretcher and carried me 15 miles through the mountains?" "I dragged you mostly," Timothy said with a tired smile. "And it was not 15 miles. It just felt like 15 miles. Actually, it was almost exactly 15 miles, said Bill McCarthy, who had returned to check on them. "I measured the distance from where I found you back to Pine Ridge Campground. 15.2 miles, to be exact." Emma stared at her little brother with an expression Timothy had never seen before, a mixture of gratitude and admiration, and love so deep it seemed to transform her entire face. "You saved my life," she said simply. "You would have done the same for me," Timothy replied, though they both knew that what he had accomplished was extraordinary by any measure. The story of 9-year-old Timothy Walsh and his epic journey to save his sister's life spread through Millbrook like wildfire, and then beyond to the regional news media and eventually to national television networks. Reporters wanted to interview Timothy, photographers wanted to take his picture, and government officials wanted to give him awards for heroism. But Timothy was not interested in fame or recognition. He was interested in making sure Emma recovered completely, in spending time with his mother when she was released from the hospital in Burlington, and in beginning the difficult process of grieving for his father while trying to understand what their family would look like without him. Diana Walsh returned to Millbrook a week after Timothy and Emma, looking older and more fragile than her children remembered, but alive and grateful, and determined to rebuild their shattered family. The guilt she carried over leaving her children alone in the wilderness was almost unbearable, but Timothy and Emma's forgiveness came easily and completely. "You were trying to save Dad," Timothy told his mother during one of their long conversations about what had happened. "You did what you thought was right. Nobody could have known what would happen." The Walsh family moved in with Margaret Sullivan temporarily, an arrangement that quickly became permanent as they discovered that their grandmother's house felt more like home than the duplex they had shared with Robert's ghost. Margaret's spare bedrooms became Timothy and Emma's rooms, and her kitchen became the heart of a family that was learning how to function without the chaos and uncertainty that had defined their lives for so long. Timothy returned to school after a month of recovery, but he was no longer the same 9-year-old boy who had left for a camping trip that was supposed to heal his family's wounds. His classmates and teachers treated him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity that made him uncomfortable, as if his heroism had transformed him into someone different from the quiet, bookish child they had known before. "I am still just me," Timothy told his fourth-grade teacher when she asked him to speak to the class about courage and determination. "I did not do anything special. I just did what anyone would do for someone they love." But Emma knew better. She understood that what Timothy had done required a kind of strength that most people never discovered within themselves, a willingness to sacrifice everything for someone else without expecting anything in return. She also understood that her little brother's heroism had changed him in ways that would shape the rest of his life. Emma's recovery was slower than the doctors had initially predicted, requiring months of physical therapy to regain full strength and coordination. But she approached her rehabilitation with the same determination that had driven her to climb the rock face where she had fallen. And Timothy was there every step of the way to encourage and support her. "Remember when you taught me to ride a bicycle?" Emma asked Timothy during one of her particularly difficult therapy sessions. "Remember how you ran alongside me for hours until I finally got the balance right?" "You were so stubborn," Timothy replied with a laugh. "You refused to give up even when you kept falling off." "I learned that from you," Emma said seriously. "I learned that you do not give up on the people you love, no matter how hard things get." The first anniversary of their ordeal was marked quietly, with a private visit to the memorial bench that had been installed at Pine Ridge Campground in Robert Walsh's memory. The plaque read simply, "In memory of Robert Walsh, beloved father and husband." But Timothy knew that the words could not capture the complexity of the man his father had been. "He was sick," Diana said as they sat on the bench overlooking the valley where their nightmare had begun. "Alcoholism is a disease, and your father was fighting a battle that he could not win. But he loved you both very much, and he would have been proud of what you did for each other." Timothy nodded, understanding that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, and that love could coexist with disappointment and grief. His father had failed them in the most fundamental ways, but he had also given Timothy the knowledge and skills that had made their survival possible. "The knots he taught me," Timothy said quietly. "The bowline knots that held the stretcher together. In the end, maybe that was his way of taking care of us." Emma reached over and took Timothy's hand, squeezing it gently. "He gave us each other too," she said. "And he gave us Mom. And maybe that is enough." As they walked back to their grandmother's car, Timothy reflected on how much had changed since that terrible weekend in the mountains. Emma had grown stronger and more thoughtful, having learned that survival required both courage and humility. Diana had found her way back to the woman she had been before years of stress and worry had worn her down to nothing. And Timothy had discovered that heroism was not about being fearless, but about being afraid and acting anyway when someone you love needs you. The small town of Millbrook had embraced the Walsh family in ways they had never experienced before their tragedy. Neighbors who had been strangers became friends, local businesses offered support and employment, and the community seemed determined to make sure that Timothy and Emma would never again face their problems alone. "People are basically good," Margaret Sullivan told her grandchildren during one of their evening conversations. "Sometimes they forget, sometimes they get lost in their own troubles. But when something really matters, most people will step up and do the right thing." Timothy had seen the truth of that statement in Bill McCarthy's immediate response to their emergency, in the hospital staff who had worked tirelessly to save Emma's life, and in the countless people who had offered help and support during their recovery. The kindness of strangers had been as important to their survival as Timothy's determination and Emma's resilience. As Timothy entered his teenage years and Emma prepared for high school, they occasionally gave interviews to journalists writing about their story, always emphasizing that their survival had been a team effort that included not just their own efforts but the support of an entire community. They spoke at schools and civic organizations about the importance of family, the power of determination, and the simple truth that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. "Heroes do not always wear capes," Timothy would tell these audiences, using a phrase that had become associated with their story. "Sometimes heroes are just kids who love their sisters enough to do whatever it takes to keep them safe." Emma would usually add, "And sometimes heroes are little brothers who are braver than they know and stronger than they think they are." But in their private moments, away from the media attention and public recognition, Timothy and Emma simply enjoyed being siblings who had learned to treasure each other in ways that most brothers and sisters never experienced. They had been through hell together and had emerged on the other side with a bond that nothing could break. On quiet Sunday mornings, when they were helping their grandmother prepare breakfast or working together on homework assignments, Timothy would sometimes catch Emma watching him with that same expression of gratitude and admiration she had worn in the hospital bed all those years ago. And Emma would catch Timothy doing the same thing, both of them remembering that they had been willing to die for each other and had instead learned how to live. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not been there?" Emma asked Timothy during one of these moments. "No," Timothy replied honestly. "Because you were there and I was there, and that is all that matters. We took care of each other, just like families are supposed to do." The last chapter of their story was not written in the mountains or in the hospital or even in the years of recovery that followed. It was written in the thousands of small moments when they chose to love each other despite their fears, to forgive each other despite their mistakes, and to build a family that was stronger than the one they had lost. Timothy Walsh would grow up to become a teacher, drawn to a profession that allowed him to help children navigate the challenges of growing up in an uncertain world. Emma Walsh would become a nurse, following in their mother's footsteps and dedicating her life to caring for people in their most vulnerable moments. But they would always be, first and foremost, the brother and sister who had learned in the Vermont wilderness that love is not just a feeling but an action, not just a promise but a practice, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simple decision to never give up on the people who matter most. Years later, when Timothy's own children asked him to tell them the story of their famous father and aunt, he would always end the same way. "The most important thing we learned was not about survival or heroism or courage. The most important thing we learned was that we were never really alone, because we had each other. And as long as we have each other, we can survive anything." And in the comfortable silence that followed, surrounded by the family they had built from the ashes of the one they had lost, Timothy and Emma would share a look that said everything words could never express, that they had kept their promise to each other, that they had made it home, and that the long walk through the wilderness had led them exactly where they needed to be.